we'll start with structural directives. Things like now they can be if, so they can be switch or for. So append ng in front of it, it's like ngIf, ngSwitch, and ngFor, right? So now what is ngIf? ngIf is like if else clause we have, right? So we can actually use this in our templates on conditionally enabling or rendering the component or rendering an element or completely wiping out element based on some conditions, right? We'll see some of the examples we have. And then we have ngSwitch. Switch is like a switch case. So we can have elements using different ng templates or generally different elements based on condition which matches with the switch expression. um, we can actually render the element or the directives or the HTMLs required, and remaining we can just wipe out. So these two are conditional based rendering or hiding. We should not call hiding, like it's like wiping out the markup we have. Whereas ngFor is reiterating kind of repetitive rendering of an element with different set of values or data. That's what is ngFor. So let's start with ngIf first. So let me take a simple example here. Let's have a simple horizontal rule. So this will create a simple line here. Now let me take a simple div saying this is sample text something. Now if I go back, so now I have a simple text called this is a sample text. Now if I append something called, now all the structural directives whatever we have start with star. I say ngIf. So let me just say like a true. Now I'm hard coding the value saying ngIf. If it is true, then render the value. So now if you go back here to the browser, right? So now you will see, is there anything wrong here? Oh, sorry. I think it's camel casing, my mistake here. Yeah. So it's a camel casing anyways. I just forgot and typed in capital F. It's a small f. So ngIf true. If it is true, yes, I want this value element to be rendered. Let me give this as a false and go back. So if it renders, you see that the element itself is white. So here, if I go back and see the element here, if you see this before HR, let me go back to this element, and if you see before HR, right, we don't have an element named div with some content. It's completely wiped out. It doesn't render because of ngIf. Now, so improving this concept. Now here we are hard coding this. Now is there a way that we can actually drive this from component? Yes, we can do. Same way we used to do for properties, right? Like for classes and stuff we have seen. Now we can actually create a property in my current class. Let's say I want to say public is like shown as, let's say, true, right? So this is a property we have in a component class. Let's use this in here. Now see, as we remember the property binding and stuff before, whenever we give any angular element or attribute for a HTML element, right, then we don't have to use the bindings. Actually, always remember that. Okay, otherwise if you're not actually using the elements, then we have to go with the bindings. Okay, that's a advantage we have. Like if I'm using ng style or something, I don't have to actually give interpolation. I can directly give an angular whenever it tries to convert this element into HTML DOM element. It does understand what it has to do. Okay. Now whenever I say is shown, it does see into my component saying, okay, do I have a property with this? Yes, I do have, and the value is true. So it does read as a true, and it will try to render that. If I go back to this, now you can see we have a value here. Now if I go back and say false, let's say for instance I don't need this, go back and say, now it will be wiped out. Right, so that's how you can actually have ngIf. Now again, even you can have here, you can also have something called expression. So now let's see with the expression in the sense, either you can use it in component or you can actually use it even here. So let me use the same input which we have used and try to render it over here, okay, just for instance. Now what I'm gonna do here is just to take a simple, let's say public something like value for data something, let me give some 10, right? And what I'm going to do, let me take a new input type text for instance, and then I'll say here I'm going to bind with ng model, right, with the value we created, value for data. Perfect. So now this is shown, anyways, so the is shown and value for data is not actually related, connected now. Now what we're going to do, now let's see, whenever I change the value, so based on this value, let's say I want to see if we can actually drive this ngIfs, right? So for instance, if I'm going to take this and say value for data is greater than 5, for instance, right, expression. Now if I go back here, let's see what happens. Now it is shown here. Let me just give 2. Can you see? Let me give some 3, 7, 1, maybe 9, right?
Yeah.
Now we are actually kind of a binding based on the value we are changing in my current page, right? We are deciding with the expression saying, okay, if this element I want to show it or not based on some element here. Now this is how we, the beauty here is these two are completely different properties we have, right? But with this value which is binded to one of the input is actually binding my ng, right? So
Mm-hmm.
now here I can also have something called if the value data is greater than 5, and for instance even if the expression changes, I want to make sure that this is always true. For instance, sure is always true, right? I'm using something called and operator, right? So this will make sure that, okay, fine, this condition should be satisfied and I should have a shown for true. So if I go here and change anything, right, can you see if I change 9 or 8, doesn't matter. Why? Because the e shown here is false, right? So whatever value you normally give to this, it doesn't matter, because this, even if this is successful, this will make sure that everything else is collapsed, because and operator is like everything should be true in order to make the condition satisfied. Let me make this true, right? So now if I go back here, now it is 10. Now yeah, my value is coming up. Let me change to 4, gone. 47, coming up again. So that's how we can actually use ngIf, right, for anything which actually comes up in this way. Now we can also drive um, the same in different other modes. Like for instance, some elements I want to go in a else section, for instance, right? It can happen that, okay, in some conditions don't show this but don't show something else, for instance, right? That can happen. So in that situation there are multiple ways we can actually do. Like a direct way is you can actually have a same element, right? I mean different element, let's say, let me call it as a else block, just a simple stuff. And you can have this expression, just say not is nothing but like a negation of the complete expression. So whenever this is true, this will be rendered, and if it is false output, then this will be rendered. So here, yeah, this is sample text in SBOC. For instance, so let me just say 3 here. Can you see?
Mm-hmm.
So if the expression goes wrong, it is kind of actually taking into second section of it, which is kind of, now again this is not an kind of an S block, because this is again a separate ngIf, which is kind of a different expression which is taking the not part of the complete expression. But yes, we can actually go with this, saying, okay, if this element is satisfied, then render this, otherwise then render this part. Now having said that, we have a very classic and good way of actually rendering the else part too. Now let's see how we can actually do that. So let me just remove this. I don't want to actually go and actually completely take the expression and say if it is not, then otherwise what happens if the expression is too big, you have to actually make sure that whenever you're changing it, right, you have to copy the same expression here and say if it is false, right? We don't want to do that because that is kind of an we are kind of a duplicating things here, which we don't want to do. Now, so here what exactly we can do to actually make this else block render. We have something called template based else here. Now what is that? So I can have some templates. So we have something called ng templates. So we can have a template with the name. So when I say template with the name, every template sectioning we have, right, will be referenced with the name. I hope you have actually seen this referencing name during our template reference variable, right? Like
Yeah.
we can actually give some referencing and that referencing can be used with a ID.
Mhm.
Now, so let's say this, I'm going to take it as, let's say else block, right? I'm going to give just, it's just a name. Okay. Don't go with the, let me just call it as AL block. So anything. So this template is my else block for instance now. So I'm going to remove this. I don't want to do this stuff. Oh, sorry. I don't want to do this way. I want to go into purely a template based way so that I know what exactly I'm doing. So here within this I can have a div for instance, and I'll say else block, right? So now, so here we have ngIf saying, okay, so if this is happening, then just do this. Now, how can we actually append the else block to this if? It's very simple. So if you have a condition, yes, this is a condition I have, for instance, we know conditional operator, right?
Yeah.
So the conditional
Question
operator
mark.
is, yeah, same way. So for instance, I'm gonna include this in expression. I'll say semicolon here and else. So yes, I mean, if it is a else, like if that expression doesn't actually match, then what to do? Then say, yes, I want to get this. That's all. So what happens? If this expression is satisfied, then this will be executed. This element will come up. If it doesn't, then this element will be rendered within this. Now here the beauty is this ng template until unless you render into any one of the element, this element will never be rendered. You can actually have ng template as much of code as you want into a separate directive, and you can just have a referencing into this. That's the beauty here. Okay, so now let's go back and see here. So if it is 10, let's say 3, see else block. So this else block is actually coming from the template. So now if I go back and see this here, see here. So what is happening? So whatever else block we have, that was the actual data which is mentioned in a template, right? But if you see here, it feels as if we gave in a same div, right? Now let me just go back and say 30. Can you see here? This changes, but still it's the same div where the data is coming up. Now the template content, whatever we have, it actually renders it and pulls it back into the same div we have. That's the beauty of templating we have. So similarly, right, if you want to, now we can actually improve the concept much further. So as we have a else block, we can also have template for if block also, right? It is not mandatory that we always have to go into ng from the same div or a same element we are actually kind of rendering. I can just say I don't want to give anything here. Let's say I want to give in my template itself. For instance, let's say this is my true block, for instance. This is my, let's say, false block or EL block, right? So what I can do here, if the expression is valid, I want to render this template within this div element. Else, I want to render the EL block, like which is like a else block within this uh, div element. Any confusion here?
No, I'm good.
It's good. Now let's see how we can give. So same as we have a conditional operator. So expression semicolon, then say meaning, okay, fine, if this is true, then give me true block, right? Okay, fine. If something goes, this expression is not true, then go into the else is AL block. Clear? So now this is how we normally play around with ngIf. This is the main concept we have. Expression, it can be expression or a property or whatever you want to say. Fine, this is my success block, this is my failure block. Now if you go back here, it's 10. It should render 3 is my else block. Did I give anything wrong here? True block, this is my template here. Else block, this is my template here. So we have an ng template with the true block hash and the with div. Perfect. We have expression and then block, perfectly given here, and then we have an ng template el block. Okay, and then el block we are giving it an r else block. So now if I give through, 2 is else block, right? Because it is not greater than 5. If I give 8, the sample text, it works. Now you just have to make sure that the naming here, right, is whatever name you give, that referencing template reference name, whatever we mention, have to be same here. Okay, maybe I just typed in here the wrong name before, but yeah, that's how. Now you can see here, if the expression is true, it says okay, bring in this template, and if it expression is false, then it brings up the else block. That's how
Okay.
your
Yeah.
ngIf works. Okay, so now you can use this template now anywhere. See, don't just restrict whatever we are actually rendering here, but now you can actually use this template modeling in anywhere you want, right? So kind of, yeah. So any questions in ngIf now?
No, I'm
So
good.
that's what we have for ngIf, right? The conditional based rendering a element. Now let's go into ngSwitch. Now when we're talking about switch, we know that we'll have different cases, right? So when we talk about switch, we normally give the switch is nothing but we have a switch with some expression, and based on the expression, whenever it matches with any of the case, so that case will be triggered. Whatever we include code or element in that case switch case element, it will be rendered and it will just exit out the switch, and every other case will be discarded from execution, right? So similarly, we can actually do that here. So let's go ahead and see how we can have that. Let me have a horizontal ruler, and just before this, let me just take, that's fine. So let me take name here, and let me take Tom here, and let me take Ken here, and here I'm gonna say this is Tom. Let's say let me take this as single quotes Tom value mapping and quotes Ken value mapping, and say this is Ken. So if I go back here, this is Tom. So fine, that's right. Maybe we'll actually use the same simple elements here itself. Now the main theme here is we have a ngSwitch binded with a property called name, and then we have two different cases, which switch case for Tom, switch case for 10, and then based on the property value we have, it does change to Tom and Ken. Right. So let's bind this with the input here we have. So let me just create a simple input type. I have a text, and let me give my bind. Oops. Let me give the binding model to, which is ng model to the name property. So based on the name we're changing, it automatically triggers what to do. So now if I go back here, let's say I'm gonna say Tom 1. So now the case here is if I click on Tom, it comes up. If I give provide Ken, it comes up. Now if I give something else, it doesn't. Now in order to handle something else, which means if no case does match, right, then we have one of the case called ngSwitch default. ngSwitch default. So no data matching, for instance. So here we're just saying we have a different switch cases. Now with the different switch cases, we are actually taking up whatever value is matching. If value doesn't match, then we are actually going into the default mapping, and the default mapping will say no data matching. So let's go back here and let's say here. So whenever we type in which doesn't actually match, it automatically goes into the default one. So this is the same default we have in switch. Default is nothing but the one which will be executed when no case actually kind of triggers inside the switch. Clear now? Any questions here?
No, I'm good.
Perfect. Now let's go into the next one called for loop, which is or ngFor. So ngFor is to make certain elements repetitive, right? Render repetitively with different values as such, right? So now let's take a simple look at it. Let me just go into simple HR horizontal rule. Now before that, let me take few elements to loop on. Let's say I'm going to take public, for instance. Let's say data names, just some names which I can actually use to render. So let's say I'm going to give some Tom. I'm going to give Ken, Kim, something bin, for instance. I have these data names, which is an array I have, which is kind of an array of strings I have. So now I want to loop through this data and then print all these names we have within a HTML element here. So let's go back and see how we can actually do it. So now I'm going to take a simple div, and in this div I'm going to have ngFor star ngFor. Oops, yeah, that's right. So now it actually takes something called, I have to give one star. Let is a let me just type it here. So let is, we are actually defining any looping variable. Let's say I'm going to take x of, now for which set or which iterating element you want to actually try the loop on. Let's say data names. So I'm going to say let x of these data names, which means this is simply like like we have ngFor where this is like a for each we have, like for each of x in the names, right? So I want to print the value. What value I want to print? I want to print the x. So x is each iterating element we have inside the value for data names. So let's go back here. Now you can see we have Tom, Ken, Kim, and Bin. So these are the elements we have for data names. So it's loops on and then it actually prints up our values we have. So that's a ngFor. Now in ngFor, right, in Angular basically, so normally we have many other concepts we have. So let's get into this. So
So from where you got the data names?
we gave data names here.
Oh, it's as a
It is a,
property, right?
yeah, I just
Okay.
gave it as a property,
Okay.
as a data names, and that data names is for source for us. So in order to understand that iteration number you're actually in, we have something called index. So I can actually get my index, for instance, as, let me call it as I. So whenever the items are actually getting looped on, even this I value will be initialized or assigned to the current index we have. So let me just print that I2. So I is my index. Let me give a simple hyphen. So if I go back and see the data, right, you can see array always starts from 0. It says zeroth element is Tom, first element is Ken, Kim, and Bin. Right? So this is my indexing I have, which is like it actually gives me each index of an element. Now, so that's the index. So second concept we have is we can actually find out what's the first element, or whenever iteration is happening, does the first element of a array or the iterative variable during that iteration, which one is the first element? So let's say I'm going to take it as first. first as I. Now, which means that whenever first element hits up, this will be assigned as a boolean flag. If I go back here, and you can see the first elements will be true and all other elements will be false. So during iteration, if you want to do some logical things in first and do some other stuff, so for all others you can just have this I. Instead of actually taking index, saying if index equal to 0 and do this stuff and that stuff, you can also use first. Similarly, you have something called last. Last is nothing but your last element of the iteration will be assigned, or whenever you take any variable with the last, right, that will give you a true boolean. And these are very helpful if you're actually doing any DOM operations based on the first or last element, for instance, right? So this will help us. Instead of actually going through each index and have multiple if condition and stuff, we can actually use last and first for doing operations as such, right? And then we have first and last, and we can also get something called odd elements. Odd element in the sense, one, when we are actually iterating, I want all the odd elements. If you see 0, 1, 2 and 3, so odd elements of my iteration will be flagged as true when I'm using any variable across my odd. Similarly, we have even. So if I go through, so all my even elements will be, I can actually find all my even elements, even iteration elements. It doesn't actually have to do anything with data as such, but I can actually find all like even placed elements here. So when I say even placed, right, it automatically takes into a face value, because 0 and 2. So that's how it goes. When I say odd values, so as our array starts from 0 to and so on, it actually takes the face value of an index and it automatically says whether it's an even or odd. That's how it works. Okay, so that's how we normally have our first element, last element, even elements, odd elements, or iterating elements across, and then finding the index using ngFor. That's ngFor we have. Any questions?
No, I'm good.
Okay, so I think this is ngFor, switch, and if we have, go back to the switch case again, and then let's see with the expression we have. So let me go back to the name I have, which I think the name we have used it for the switch case, right? So let's go back and see with the number. Let me take a new HTML DOM element. So in this switch I have, so this time I'm going to take this with some other value, for instance, value for data. Let me take it to value for data. So I'm going to take, for instance, 1, let's say 2, right? So here I'm going to, so this is 1, I'll say something like this is, I'll say 2, I have, and let's say no matching element, no matching number I have. So here, now let's see how it works. So I have a number here. Let me just take 1 first, which is a number. So you can see here, so for the number expression, it's a direct value we have, right? So we don't have to actually give into a string mode of value. It's a direct value here. And you can also bind this with a input, which kinds of takes up the string, and again it converts internally into the number. So let's say I'm going to take type text, and then let me bind it with the ng model. Let me bind this with the value for data. So let's go back here. So let me give 2, let me give 3, no matching number. Can you see? So even if you bind it, end of the day, the property which is actually binded here is the number, and the number will be automatically converted based on the value we are actually setting, and we can actually use a switch.
Okay.
Okay, so that's we have for structural directives for today. So I think this three, right, we can actually have multiple, I mean even different expressions. Whatever expressions we normally use can be have here. So simple thing is, in the switch you can have an expression and the matching value. So this matching value completely depends on what type of expression or what type of switch you're actually trying to map. Fine. So that's how it is. It can be a boolean. Even if you have a boolean, for instance, let's say this is a boolean, I can take this value for as, let's say, true, and this true value is a direct face value of a boolean, so I can just say true or false, right? So now if it is true, binding, but if I go back and say value for true is false, false here, come back, then says this is true, because these two is binded to the false. Expression to case binding, clear now?